Hello everyone, welcome to Skiofron. Today we're going to be doing a lecture on psychohistory from fiction to emerging reality. So, in this video, I want to formalize and describe what psychohistory is, and then understand if psychohistory is a usable and understandable science for our day and age. So the opening question I want to ask is, can the future of humanity be predicted? If you have any answers to that question, put it in the comments below before we answer that question later in the lecture. So at first, this may sound impossible. Human beings are complicated, and individuals are a lot of times irrational. They don't make the best choices. We have free will, or maybe you're a determinist and don't believe that, but by and large, it seems that human actions are not predictable. Maybe in the grand scheme of things they are, but to our science and our technology, we are not able to do that. And so I'm going to go into describe, are we able to predict at society large scale? So maybe we're not able to predict individual human actions at the micro level, but at a society-wide scale, can we predict the movement of a country, a culture, and that sort of thing? And so essentially we're going to be understanding, does history obey laws the same way as nature does? Because if history obeys laws, then we'll be able to develop a mathematics of psychohistory. So the origin of psychohistory is from the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. So it started with this mathematician named Harry Seldon, who near the end of the First Empire developed this science where he's able to predict behavior of populations at scale. So he's able to understand that the empire is falling and that in the next 200 years there will be no empire any longer. And after that, the entire galaxy will fall into disarray and there will be wars and conflict and a lot of suffering. So he decides that he needs to figure out how to shorten the amount of time before a second empire rises and create stability and peace throughout the galaxy. And so he does this by creating two foundations. One is to create the governmental structure, the people, and essentially, as the name suggests, the foundation for that second empire. Because from that planet Terminus, in which he founds it on, it will then grow to cover the entire galaxy. He also then creates a second foundation, which is this is a spoiler, but it's essentially the guardians of the galaxy, you could say, which are psychohistorians that make sure that humanity stays on the path towards the Second Empire, towards the Seldon plan. And so they are there to intervene and protect humanity. So essentially, if you boil everything down, it is the idea that civilization can be modeled mathematically. So psychohistory is a statistical science of human populations. It combines mathematics, sociology, and probability, and it posits that individuals are unpredictable while populations are not. So this means that psychohistory is not concerned primarily with personal biography or singular events. Instead, it is concerned with trends, regularities, mass movements, and collective behavior. It is a science of patterns rather than persons. The more people you include, the more individual randomness begins to disappear. The more people you include, the more individual randomness begins to disappear into larger statistical order, and that idea leads us into the next major point. So the easiest way to understand psychohistory is through an analogy to physics. If you look at a single molecule in a gas, its motion is highly unpredictable. It moves in ways that are too complex to track exactly in practice. But if you look at billions upon billions of molecules together, you can describe the gas mathematically. You can measure its pressure, temperature, and volume. So while the individual molecule is unpredictable, the aggregate system becomes predictable. Psychohistory applies the same logic to human beings. A single person is difficult to predict, but millions or billions of people taken together may begin to display stable patterns. In this sense, psychohistory treats society as something like a thermodynamic system. History becomes legible not because every individual is known in full detail, but because the large-scale structure of collective behavior becomes statistically visible. So then there's going to be three assumptions. So the first assumption is scale. large populations are required. The larger the population, the more stable the predictions become. Small groups are too volatile. Individuals can dramatically affect outcomes, but once you reach very large numbers, the chaos of individual variation begins to average out. This is similar to the law of large numbers and probability. Randomness at the local level can produce regularity at the aggregate level. So psychohistory is only possible if the system under study is enormous. It is not designed for a family, a classroom, or even a small town. It is designed for civilizations, empires, or planetary populations. That requirement of scale seemed almost fantastical when Asimov wrote it. But today, for the first time in history, humanity may actually possess systems that operate at something close to that scale. The knowledge constraint. The second major assumption is one of the most fascinating. The population being predicted must not know the prediction in a way that allows them to change it. Why? Because once people know what is expected of them, they can react to that knowledge. They may resist it, exploit it, or alter the behavior in response. That means the prediction itself becomes part of the system. This creates a reflective problem. A forecast about human behavior can influence the behavior it forecasts. So psychohistory requires a kind of ignorance, or at least limited awareness. The system must be predictable without being continually disrupted by people consciously responding to the prediction. In other words, the future becomes difficult to predict when people know enough to try to escape it. Human nature must be stable. The third assumption is that human behavior must be relatively stable over time. Psychohistory depends on the idea that, although cultures and institutions change, the deeper patterns of human motivation do not change too quickly. Desires, fears, ambitions, group loyalties, and social tendencies must remain consistent enough to model. If human nature were changing radically from one generation to the next, then no long-range predictive science could succeed. The inputs would be too unstable. So psychohistory assumes that beneath historical events, there are durable regularities in human conduct. This system changes, but not so quickly that statistical order disappears. This assumption is essential because without some continuity in human behavior, there can be no enduring science of history. From fiction to theory. At this point, psychohistory may still sound like science fiction, but the underlying idea is not entirely foreign to real intellectual history. Thinkers such as Auguste Comte imagined something like a social physics, where society could be studied with scientific rigor. Emile Durkheim showed that even something as personal as suicide could display stable statistical patterns across populations. Later, game theory and systems theory, which was developed by John von Neumann, attempted to model strategic behavior in large-scale interactions mathematically. So the deeper intuition behind psychohistory already exists in fragments. We have sociology, economics, political science, statistics, complexity theory, and machine learning. What we do not have yet is a single unified science that brings them all together into a coherent predictive model of history. This is why psychohistory remains partly fictional, but not entirely implausible. So the question is no longer, could we build psychohistory? The more pressing question may be, are we already building something like it without calling it that? This is where the discussion moves from literature into our own technological world. Because if psychohistory requires enormous data, predictive models, and population scale analysis, then we have to admit that many of those ingredients now exist. We may not have a single science called psychohistory, but we do have systems that collect data on human behavior at a massive scale and use that data to generate predictions. That should immediately make us pause. The modern world produces an immense amount of behavioral data. Every time someone searches for something online, clicks a link, makes a purchase, pauses on a video, likes a post, shares a message, or moves through physical space with a connected device, data is generated. This data is not abstract. It is the recorded trace of human attention, desire, movement, preference, and action. In other words, it is behavioral residue. In early ages, most human activity disappeared almost instantly into the past. Today is captured, stored, sorted, and analyzed. That changes everything. If psychohistory requires data about how people behave, modern society produces that data constantly and at an enormous scale. Who collects this data? This data is collected by large technological systems and institutions. Search engines, social media platforms, e-commerce systems, smartphone ecosystems, ad networks, and AI companies all participate in this process. What matters here is not simply that data is collected, but that it is collected continuously, globally, and at scale. This means that human behavior is no longer something observed only occasionally through surveys or census reports. It is now captured in real time through everyday participation in digital life. That creates a new kind of social visibility. Human populations are becoming legible to computational systems in ways that would have been unimaginable even a few decades ago. The predictive engine. Once that data exists, the next question is, what do we do with it? This is where machine learning enters the picture. Machine learning systems are designed to find patterns in data. They can identify correlations, classify behavior, estimate future actions, and model likely outcomes. Recommendation systems predict what people are likely to click. Ad systems predict what people are likely to buy. Language models predict what word, phrase, or idea is likely to come next in a sequence. The important part is that these systems do not merely store data, they transform data into prediction. This is why machine learning begins to resemble one of the core functions of psychohistory. It takes large-scale human-generated data and turns it into probabilistic models of future behavior. A critical threshold. Now we arrive at something historically new. For most of human history, even if one wanted to create something like psychohistory, the scale requirement could not be met. There was no way to collect enough data, fast enough, across enough people to model civilization as a whole. Today, that is no longer true. We now live in a globally networked world with billions of connected users, continuous streams of data, and computational systems powerful enough to process enormous amounts of information. That means one of the great fictional requirements of psychohistory, civilization-scale observation, has, at least in partial form, become technically possible. This does not mean psychohistory fully exists, but it does mean that its material preconditions are far more real than they were in Asimov's time. Two models. At this point, it helps to distinguish between the fictional psychohistory and what we might call modern proto-psychohistory. In the fictional form, psychohistory is centralized. It is a formal science. It is mathematically unified. It is known and directed by a small number of experts. In the modern form, what emerges is much more decentralized. There is no Harry Seldon. There is no master equation. Instead, there are countless systems, platforms, algorithms, models, and institutions, all gathering data and generating predictions within their own domains. So modern psychohistory cannot look like a single discipline descending from above. It would look like an emergent network of predictive systems operating across society. In this sense, psychohistory today would be less like a completed science and more like a distributed technological condition. A critical shift. But here we reach an even more important point. Modern systems do not merely predict behavior, they also shape it. A recommendation algorithm does not just guess what you might watch, it directs your attention towards certain options. A social media feed does not merely observe your interests, it amplifies some things and suppresses others. Targeted advertising does not merely record desire, it attempts to produce and guide desire. This means that modern predictive systems are not passive observers, they are active participants. That creates a major difference from Asimov's model. Psychohistory and fiction is primarily predictive. The systems we are building today are both predictive and interventionist. They do not just forecast history, they begin to influence its path. Recursive system. This creates a recursive feedback loop. First, data is collected from human behavior. Second, models analyze the data and generate predictions. Third, systems use those predictions to shape what people see, buy, think about, or respond to. Fourth, new behavior is generated and that behavior becomes new data. Then the cycle begins again. So what emerges is a self-updating system in which prediction and influence are continuously entangled. The system learns from behavior, acts upon behavior, and then learns again from the result of its own influence. This is extremely important because it means that what we are dealing with is not merely surveillance or not merely automation. It is recursive social technology that increasingly participates in the formation of collective patterns. The system knows itself. However, this brings us back to one of the great problems we discussed earlier, reflexivity. In Asimov's psychohistory, prediction works best when populations do not know the predictions in a disruptive way. But in our own world, people are increasingly aware that algorithms shape attention, behavior, and information flow. That awareness changes how people act. Some people try to game the algorithm, others resist it. Still others conform to it. This means the system is not modeling a passive population, but a population that is increasingly aware of being modeled. As a result, modern psychohistorical systems cannot be static. They have to adapt constantly. Their predictions must be updated in real time because the very act of prediction changes the environment being predicted. So if psychohistory emerges today, it will be dynamic, reflexive, and unstable in ways Asimov's version did not fully require. What is still missing? So what would still be needed for something closer to a true psychohistory? First, we would need a more unified theory of human behavior, one that successfully integrates psychology, economics, sociology, politics, and culture. Second, we would need large-scale simulation systems capable of modeling not just isolated actions, but interacting agents across time. Third, we would need causal understanding, not just correlation. It is one thing to predict that certain behaviors are likely. It is another to understand why they emerge and how changes in conditions will transform them. Finally, we would need some way of handling reflexivity and feedback, because the predictive science of society becomes much more difficult when society can respond to the prediction. So while we may have many of the ingredients, we still do not possess a completed psychohistory in the strong sense. Is this intentional? Now we should be careful and precise. It would be too simple to say that companies and institutions are openly trying to build psychohistory as such. In most cases, the immediate motives are more ordinary: profit, efficiency, optimization, influence, market advantage, and control over information flows. However, if psychohistory is not the explicit goal, it may still be the functional direction in which these systems are moving. That is, the incentives that drive large-scale data collection and AI development, whether commercial, political, or strategic, also push these systems toward broader and broader predictive power over human populations. So the stronger claim is not that everyone is secretly building psychohistory on purpose. The stronger, more defensible claim is that our technological systems are converging towards psychohistorical functions, whether or not they name them that way. Where we stand. So where does that leave us? Psychohistory does not yet exist as a formal unified science. There is no single discipline that can reliably predict the future of civilization in the way Asimov imagined, and yet many of its key conditions now exist: population-scale data collection, predictive modeling, real-time adaptation, and systems that both observe and influence collective behavior. What we are seeing then may be the emergence not of psychohistory as an invention, but of psychohistory as a systemic tendency. It is not centralized, it is not complete, it is not fully coherent, but it is increasingly real. And that makes the concept worth taking seriously, not only as science fiction, but as a lens through which to interpret the technological structure of the present. So thank you guys all for watching. I have a few discussion questions that I would like you guys to then discuss in the comments below and answer. So the first is, do you find something like psychohistory desirable? The next is, who would control such systems and in whose interest would they operate? Then we have, can predictive technologies ever remain neutral, or do they always become tools of influence? And last, if the future becomes increasingly modeled and managed, what happens to freedom, spontaneity, and historical openness? So I'd like to thank you guys all for watching and listening to this lecture. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.